Okay, so today we're going to talk about a very specific psychological fracture, which is the inability to feel finished when trying to complete a task. So, we're not talking about the inability to finish. We're talking about the inability to feel finished. It's a problem that grows with intelligence and with agency. You do more, you complete more, but nothing actually feels done. And it's not because you're neurotic or perfectionistic. It's because something in the structure of your mind has learned to resist closure. So, this brings up this concept that I've found helpful as I've witnessed this phenomenon in my own life called the Zeigarnik effect. And it's where unfinished tasks retain priority. So, in 1927, Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik discovered something really strange that people remember interrupted tasks significantly better than completed tasks. And this effect was so pronounced that even small, trivial actions, when interrupted, lingered in memory far longer than important completed actions. So, this became known as the Zeigarnik effect, and it's the psychological tendency for incomplete tasks to dominate mental attention. Unfinished business sticks. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. The brain is a problem solving machine. Anything unresolved could be a potential threat, so it stays loaded. But the modern work environment amplifies this to pathological levels. So you have dozens of open tabs and multiple projects and partial outcomes, and you begin to rely on this. You begin to rely on this tendency as a method for project management and productivity. You keep all these partial outcomes and you realize, oh, my brain sticks to all these things. And then you have all these partial outcomes and deferred decisions. And most high agency individuals live in a constant fog of micro unfinished loops. And these are loops that don't just remain open, they actually multiply. So, how can we address this? Well, we have to come up with something called narrative closure, which requires us to distinguish between tasks and episodes. Because the problem is really deeper than cognitive task management. Um, Narrative psychologists have studied this role of what they call episodic closure, which is the sense that events resolve into meaningful segments of life. So when episodes don't resolve, the self can't move. Even if the event is finished externally, internally it remains suspended. So there's a philosopher named Paul Ricoeur. One of my, well, I find him to be a very intriguing philosopher. He has a book called Time and Narrative, 1984, explored how people construct coherence across temporal spans. And closure for Ricoeur is not about finality. Closure for Ricoeur is about narrative integration. It's the way we make sense of action across time. And when your sense of identity is always looking forward, always leaping into the next action, there's no felt endpoint. The act is complete, but the arc remains open. So here we have these intersecting concepts of agency and memory. And I want to introduce this new concept of residue or the residual. So high performers tend to compound this problem because they automate success and they iterate quickly. They carry more open loops than most people can handle. But their memory systems still obey the Zeigarnik dynamic. Their narrative systems still demand episodic integration that they're not allowing themselves to have. So even after a significant event or even a completion event, like a launch or a big report that they give or a big win that they get, there's still no sense of shift, no internal baton pass, only this mental echo of momentum that won't quiet down. Completion, while maybe even real, becomes invisible because the actor has no time to receive the event. So this gives rise to the phenomenon of what psychologists call the false the false alternative, which is that we finish more and we care less. So most people respond to this tension in one of two ways, right? Number one, they try to finish everything, where they close all loops. They get to inbox zero. They document, they archive, they wrap up. And number two is they just try to stop caring, where they numb the system, they avoid emotional investment, they assume nothing will feel meaningful, and neither really works. The former is impossible, right? Finishing everything, and the latter is corrosive. Try to stop caring, right? A relevant thing to mention here is this concept of polarity management. Highly recommend that you look into this, where it's not so much about where it shifts your frame of mind from a leadership perspective, from solving problems to managing polarities, right? So how are we going to solve this problem? What's the solution? So polarity management is kind of an alternative to solutions oriented thinking, where we say, yeah, maybe this particular set of phenomena that give rise to tension shouldn't be labeled as problematic because that invites solution-oriented thinking, whereas we need these tensions to exist, and they are not problems in themselves. They're just sensed sources of stress, and what we need to do is manage these polarities rather than resolve the tension between them. So we kind of keep this tension in motion. So that's something to keep in mind. Definitely look into that concept of polarity management. But so back to this sense of incompletion, right? What's actually missing? What's actually missing is a sense of designed closure. The missing piece is designed closure. So a deliberate method of recognizing the shift in state from active to complete. Not in the world, but in the self. Because completion is not just a behavioral end. Completion is a narrative acknowledgement. This is why ceremonial closure has existed for millennia, right? Rituals that mark transitions and commencements and sign-offs and signatures, even handshakes is one of those things, right? Right? Like ceremonial closure is these closures signal that something is now in the past. And without that signal, the mind refuses to mark the shift. So how can we achieve this? How can we instantiate ceremonial closure in our lives to relieve our minds from this multiplying open browser tab phenomena of incompletion across all the tasks and projects in our lives? How can we instantiate episodic closure in our lives through ceremony? Well, it's important to remember that this is not about productivity per se. It's about psychological coherence. It's about mental design. So here are 3 architectural practices that reinforce the feeling of doneness or being done. Number 1 is an episodic recap. So at the end of a major task, write down 3 lines. What this completed, what this taught, what this frees up. Okay? Completed, taught, freed. Number 2, temporal bookending. So block the end of a project with a distinct, predictable act. Even something as simple as an export, a send-off message, a title. It could be it could be 2 jars. I've heard of this paperclip method where you've got a jar full of paper clips and an empty jar, and then you just move one paperclip from one jar to the next, right? And that shows you how many every time you complete a task in any domain, you just move that paperclip over. It's just a sense of completion. And then your mind thinks, is that done? Oh yeah, I moved a paperclip for that one, right? And then the third thing that you could do, so you've got episodic recap where you say what is completed, what is taught, what this freed up. Temporal bookending, where you have these micro ceremonies. And number 3 would be a public acknowledgement. So this is where you share the completion. not for, praise or acknowledgement, but you just do it for the timestamp. You have to do it so that you have a collectively witnessed timestamp to this being done. This is a way to register it in external time. And it's important to remember that this is not like a product. This is not just or merely a productivity or project management hack or something like that. Closure, episodic closure, achieving, instantiating, designing a system of feeling done is a self-regulatory act. So the mistake is to assume that output is self-regulating, but it's not. The more you produce, the more intentional your closure has to be. Otherwise, momentum compounds with memory. Action fragments from meaning, and you find yourself sprinting through a life with no landmarks, and everything turns into a blur. So what are we actually solving for here? This is, and because I've listen, I love productivity YouTube. It's actually productivity YouTube and productivity books, and these things have like really helped me in my life in so many ways. I think there's a lot of things that haven't resonated with me, but that doesn't mean they haven't resonated with other people and been helpful to other people. What I know is what's been helpful to me. But sometimes this focus on productivity per se can convince you that all you're ever really missing is the strategy or the tactic or something like really granular, right? Some method. But it's, like man, if I could just achieve inbox zero, I would feel like I have that mental freedom and space, right? And typically that's just not true. There are psychological and philosophical um, decision-making processes and designs that have to be implemented in order to achieve the kind of emotional cadence and experience of our productivity that we're really searching for through being productive. Because this is not about inbox zero. It's about psychological weight and the internal tension of an unresolved life. So Ricoeur's concept of narrative time tells us that stories don't complete themselves. They must be authored. And the Zeigarnik effect tells us that the brain loads what hasn't been cleared. And I keep mentioning this book, but Byung-Chul Han, in his book, The Burnout Society, he warns us that the neoliberal subject, the endlessly productive, endlessly unfinished, mistakes output for identity. So by designing cadences of ceremonial closure to these micro loops of endlessness that just accidentally or haphazardly populate our mental space due to our over reliance on the Zeigarnik effect to just keep track of everything, right? We're trying to keep track of it. We keep everything open and we don't put things to bed and we don't put things to rest, and we resist designing and implementing systems of ceremonial closure because it helps us retain this feeling of control, right? But what it does is it ends up sabotaging us. It ends up sapping all of our energy and preventing us from taking on new responsibilities and moving forward, right? All of these unclosed experiences essentially function as a giant wind sail that just holds us back, creates friction, right? And what we want to do is reduce that so that we have as little friction as possible that we need to move forward as quickly as possible, right? We want to create thrust. And so the problem that we're solving for is not a motivation problem. What we're solving is an integration problem. Closure is not a finish line. Closure is a structural signal that the self can move.